Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 72nd deck and it's titled Hermit Humans. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I do want to highlight some of our social media accounts, some ways that you could help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So first up, we do have our Twitter and Reddit accounts. I always make sure to post the most recent videos and deck lists on those accounts, so if you're interested in updates, please do follow us over there. And I try to interact as well, trying to ask some questions and talk to people, get some games going. So if you're ever interested in reaching out, those are great ways to do it. You can also send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. And if you're looking to support our content a little bit more directly, you can go to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of this video, and any cards you purchase from their website after clicking on the link lets them know that we sent you over there, so they give us a little bit of support in return. And finally, the most direct way to support our content is our Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. You can join some of our amazing patrons right now. We have William Swiftfoot, we have Observer Will, we've got Doodle, and we have Calvin Schmidt. So if you'd like to join that awesome group of individuals, you can head on over there and get some content like the deck lists an entire week early. You get access to the unedited gameplay videos. You get access to a Discord channel where we put together games and we talk about building the decks and we try to collaborate on some of that. So if any of that sounds like something that you are interested in, please do head over there. And right now, any money that we get from that is going toward finding ways to record in-person games, because I know a lot of the push is going back toward in-person games, so I'd love to be ready for that when that finally comes. But with all of that being said, I suppose we should jump into our actual deck tech. So, first up, we do have our random card of the week, in which this case, it is a random card. It's not a suggested card like we normally do. And this one is Hermit Druid. So Hermit Druid, 1 and a green for a 1/1 Druid. It's also a human, which is slightly relevant. You can pay a green and tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a basic land card. Put that card into your hand and put all other revealed cards into your graveyard. Now, this card is notoriously a bit of a combo piece, and I'm not going to lie, we are going to be a combo deck, but we do need to have some backups just in case that doesn't go the way that we planned. And the fact that this is a combo card, the fact that it hasn't really been reprinted since Stronghold other than being in the list, kind of reflects why it is a $10 card. So unfortunately, our random card of the week is already taking up 10% of our budget, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm sure that we'll be able to do some pretty good stuff with it anyway. So moving on to our commander for this deck, I wanted to add a couple of colors to make it a little bit easier to synergize with what Hermit Druid is trying to get us to do. So in that case, we added white and black, went with an Abzan deck, and our commander for the week is Anafenza the Foremost. She is white, black, green for a 4/4 human soldier. Whenever Anafenza the Foremost attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on another target tapped creature you control. If a creature card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So that's super relevant because if we kill something, it goes, instead of going to the graveyard, it'll go into exile. If we happen to mill something or someone else mills something, no matter how the creature gets into the graveyard, it's exiled with Anafenza, and that can be brutal for a lot of decks. So we're kind of hoping Anafenza is going to draw some of the hate, maybe take away from some of our other combo pieces, which I know we haven't talked about the combo. We will get there in just a moment, trust me. But before we get to that, we do have to talk about the themes of this deck. Now, we don't do a ton of combo decks on this channel. They tend to be a little bit out of budget range, but I do want to focus on some of our backup plans first. And I know that sounds kind of weird. Why would we focus on game plan B instead of A? And I honestly think that's just because game plan A, the combo, is going to take a while to explain, so let's work up to that. Other than that, though, we do have our backup plan, which is going to be humans. Since Hermit Druid is a human, we can go pretty hard into human tribal, which is primarily in white black, and green, which works out very well for us because we can play cards like General Kudro of Drannith, which is 1 white and a black for a 3/3 legendary creature human soldier, gives other humans we control +1/+1, and whenever General Kudro of Drannith or another human enters the battlefield under our control, we can exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. Then we can pay 2, sacrifice 2 humans, and destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. So this is going to be super useful for us because not only is it pumping up our entire team, because we have a ton of humans in this deck, it's also graveyard hate, which is super important, like we mentioned with Anafenza, and it can be a sacrifice outlet plus being able to destroy big creatures. So General Kudro really does it all and is a huge reason to honestly just be in human tribal. So I did want to highlight him as a card because I think he's really sweet and doesn't see quite enough love, but that also highlights the fact that we are human tribal and we actually have about 40 different humans in this deck, so we are leaning very heavily into the human tribal aspect of this deck. And, believe it or not, that also plays into our combo, which I keep hinting at it, still not there yet, gonna have to hold on for just another minute. But we do get to our next theme, which is reanimation. Because a lot of the Abzan colors in white, black, and green focus heavily on putting creatures into the graveyard, we want to make sure that we can also get those creatures out of the graveyard. So we have cards like Unearth, which is 1 black for a sorcery, and we can return target creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. Most of our creatures tend to be pretty cheap, so this can get back almost anything that we really needed to get back, including General Kudro. And if at any point in the game we really don't need Unearth, it does still have cycling for 2, so we can just discard it, throw it away, get a new card, and that's not the worst thing in the world, but obviously we do want to use it for the reanimation. Now, moving on from our humans and also from our reanimation, we come to our final theme, which is going to be a mix of 2 different things. I kind of cheated with this last card. It's both protection and sacrifice. So Benevolent Bodyguard is 1 white mana for a 1/1 human cleric, and we can sacrifice Benevolent Bodyguard, and target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So we have a ton of ways to sacrifice things, we saw with General Kudro, because we want to bring them back with cards like Unearth, and Benevolent Bodyguard is a great way to protect some of our key pieces. If we really need to make sure General Kudro stays on board, Benevolent Bodyguard can save him from a removal spell. Same thing with Anafenza, same thing with Hermit Druid. Benevolent Bodyguard plays a ton of different roles because it's not only something we can sacrifice, but it's protection. And protection is incredibly important because it's very difficult for us to get our combo pieces on board and win that same turn. We often need at least 1 turn to set up, which means that our opponents can kind of see it coming and stop it. And so with Benevolent Bodyguard, it's nice to make sure that our opponents can't stop it, or at least have to spend multiple removal spells to stop it. So those are the themes for this deck, and the next piece of this is to take a look at some key cards, some cards that synergize very well and could honestly be win conditions in their own right. So first up, we have Zathrid Necromancer, which is 2 and a black for a 2/2 human wizard. Whenever Zathrid Necromancer or another human creature you control dies, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. So Zathrid Necromancer is amazing board wipe protection, because if our opponents see a huge board of humans and they're like, oh man, I gotta get rid of this, and they wipe the board, they just replace our humans with zombies. And yeah, they're 2/2s and they're not really synergizing with what we're doing and they don't get the Lord effects, but if we go from 15, 3/3 humans to 15 2/2 zombies, that's still pretty good considering the board wipe most likely got rid of all of our opponent's blockers as well. So Zathrid Necromancer is amazing board wipe protection, but it's also great because, as I mentioned earlier, we're sacrificing some of our creatures. So if we sacrifice a bunch of humans, we get zombies, and we can then sacrifice the zombies on top of that to trigger even more effects and do more and more and more. So Zathrid Necromancer is kind of an unassuming piece, but it really plugs a lot of key holes in this deck and helps us move closer and closer to our eventual win condition. And then coming in after Zathrid Necromancer, We also have Sigarda Heron's Grace, one of the few non-humans in the deck, but it's basically a friend to the human. It is 3 green, white for a 4/5 angel. It's got flying. You and humans you control have hexproof, so essentially this gives hexproof to our entire team except for Sigarda, which is super useful, and sometimes even just having hexproof ourselves can be very useful. Our opponents can't target us with anything, we can't be hit by spells, by abilities, anything like that, so that could be relevant. And there's also that additional graveyard hate tacked onto it. You can pay 2, exile a card from our graveyard, and create a 1/1 human soldier creature token. So I misread the card accidentally earlier. It's not all graveyards, just your graveyard, but still a very useful card because it's going to get rid of the stuff that we don't need in our graveyard. Maybe we cycled away the Unearth and, we have no need for an Unearth in our graveyard, but we do always have need for human tokens. And since Sigarda can make human soldier tokens, that's always a great use of our mana if we have stuff in our graveyard that we don't really want anymore. And finally, coming to the last of our key cards, we have Catilda Dawnheart Prime, which is green and a white for a 1/1 legendary creature, human warlock. It has protection from werewolves. I highly doubt that's going to be super relevant, but you never know. And human creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any of this creature's colors. So all of our humans now become mana dorks. And if we have 5 humans on board, that is a huge amount of mana. And what could we do with that mana, you ask? Well, with Catilda, we could pay 4 green-white and tap her to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So we can turn all of our little humans into massive humans that are still tapping for mana, still adding counters to them. Maybe they have hexproof with Sigarda, maybe our opponents wipe the board, we get zombies. The goal really is to just put as much power on the board as possible, and with Catilda, that is a distinct possibility, because she's going to give us so much mana, and just give us a mana sink to throw everything into. So these are some of our key cards, but I think I've dragged this out long enough. Normally at this point in the deck tech, we take a look at some cool interactions. I figured this week, instead of looking at cool interactions, we would take a look at the combo of this deck. Now, I will warn you, this is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to walk you through it step by step, but I do think it's very cool, and it doesn't need that much. As it may look super complicated and there's a lot of pieces to it, but we actually only need 1 card to start this combo, and that is Hermit Druid himself. So if we have Hermit Druid in play, and we of course need to untap with Hermit Druid, which is why it's incredibly important we can protect him. It's difficult to get haste, at least difficult very cheaply to get haste in the Abzan colors, so we're hoping that Hermit Druid can survive a round of the table, because we want to be able to activate his ability to tap him, reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a basic land card. Put that card into your hand, and all others revealed into the graveyard. Now, the secret to this deck is we are not playing any basic lands in this entire deck, which means if we activate Hermit Druid, we reveal cards until we reveal a basic land, which we are never going to do, and then we put all the revealed cards, which is our entire deck, into our graveyard. And I know I can already hear people asking, why in the world would we want to take our entire deck and just throw it into the graveyard? Yeah, we've got reanimation stuff, but that's not going to be super powerful when we only have 1 more turn. And so the key is, once all of our stuff is in the graveyard, we have Dread Return also in the graveyard. And Dread Return is 2 black for a sorcery that says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And it has flashback of sacrifice 3 creatures. So we don't need any mana to be able to cast Dread Return. And unfortunately, yes, we might run into the situation where we activate Hermit Druid and we have no other creatures. If that's the case and we don't have the creatures to activate Dread Return, luckily, we also have Lingering Souls, which is 2 and a white for a sorcery. Create 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. And it also has flashback for 1 and a black. So if we activate Hermit Druid, have no other creatures, we can flashback Lingering Souls, and for 3 total mana, so 1, a black, and a green to activate Hermit Druid, cast Lingering Souls, we can now cast Dread Return for free. And there is 1 specific creature in our deck that is now in our graveyard that we want to get back with Dread Return. and that is Angel of Glory's Rise. Angel of Glory's Rise is 5 white for a 4/6 angel. It's got flying, and when Angel of Glory's Rise enters the battlefield, exile all zombies. Might be relevant, who knows? Then, the key part of this, return all human creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. We have, as I mentioned earlier, around 40 humans in this deck. So, we put our entire library into the graveyard, we cast Dread Return, we get back Angel of Glory's Rise, brings back all 40 humans out of our graveyard. So once that resolves, we have, if everything goes perfect and we hit every single human in our deck, we have 43 total humans on board. How does that help us win the game? Because I said earlier, right, we don't have haste. The key is a Cartel Aristocrat and Zulaport Cutthroat. They will both come back with this ability, and with Cartel Aristocrat, which is a white and a black for a 2/2 human advisor, we can sacrifice another creature, and Cartel Aristocrat gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. The protection isn't super relevant, but it is going to be relevant that it's a free sacrifice outlet, because then we can sacrifice 43 humans, triggering Zulaport Cutthroat, which is 1 and a black for a 1/1 human rogue ally. Whenever Zulaport Cutthroat or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So, we have 43 creatures in play. We sacrifice 41 of them because we can't sacrifice the Aristocrat or the Cutthroat, but that does about 40 damage to each opponent. That should, if nobody has gained any life, win us the game on the spot. Now, I'm aware of how Commander works, and I'm aware that there will most likely be someone who has gained at least a little bit of life, putting them above 40. So, what do we do if this doesn't kill our opponent? There are 2 answers to that question. The first of which we've actually already talked about, that is Zathrid Necromancer. Because we sacrifice 40 humans, we do 40 damage to each opponent, we get 40 zombies. Then we can sacrifice the 40 zombies to do 40 more damage. That's an 80 damage total to each of our opponents. That should end the game, but again, I understand how Commander works. Maybe there is someone who has even more than 80 life. That is where our final piece of this comes in, Marin of Clan Nel Toth. Now, Marin of Clan Nel Toth is 2 black and a green for a 3/4 legendary creature human shaman. Whenever another creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. So it sees all 40 of our creatures die. We get 40 experience counters. We kill off all of our zombies. We get 40 more experience counters. Then, at the beginning of your end step, choose target creature card in your graveyard. If that card's converted mana cost is less than or equal to the number of experience counters you have, return it to the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. So we have 80 experience counters, we've done 80 damage to the table, we have gained 80 life. We move to our end step with our 80 experience counters, trigger Marin, target the Angel of Glory's Rise, bring it back into play, which brings all of our humans back into play, and we repeat this process again in our end step, meaning we can, in a perfect world of course, do approximately 160 damage in 1 turn with just Hermit Druid and some other cards in our graveyard. Now, I am well aware that this is a bit of a tricky combo to pull off, because if anyone has any graveyard hate, it can really mess with it, but ideally, this is what we will use to win the game. And we kind of have to hope it wins, because if we activate this and we somehow don't manage to kill somebody, we no longer have any cards in our library, so as soon as we go to draw for a card for our turn, we just die. So this can be a little bit tricky, so I would recommend you at least keep an eye on that, but I think this is super sweet. I would love to be able to win a game like this at some point, and I think this makes a great version of this deck. So hopefully we'll see how that combo works at some point, and if it doesn't work for me, then maybe you can also build the deck and try it out for yourself. But of course, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel as well, just as a thank you for coming up with quite the combo here, because like I said, I think this is cool. But we can move on from the deck tech itself and get into the actual budget of the deck, which this week came in pretty close to our budget limit, $98.50, and our most expensive card doesn't actually play super well with the rest of our cards, but it is surprisingly important. And that card is Eladamri's Call. It's about $11, and it is a green and a white for an instant that says search your library for a creature card, reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Hermit Druid is really important to what this deck is trying to do. And there's not a ton of tutor effects that get creatures that are easy to cast, or at least cheap enough to put into the deck, and then are also easy to cast. So Eladamri's Call, yeah, it's expensive, it's $11, but to basically have a second copy of Hermit Druid in the deck is pretty invaluable. And there are a couple of other tutors, but Eladamri's Call being 2 mana makes it incredibly useful, because oftentimes we can cast Eladamri's Call, get Hermit Druid, and then immediately cast Hermit Druid as well. Hopefully, still having some mana to leave up protection. So, I would highly recommend that you keep Eladamri's Call in the deck if you can, but if you do need to cut it, there are other ways to try to do the same effect, at least in a similar way, but it is pretty good at what it does. However, on the other hand, if you're looking to maybe increase the price of the deck or add in some other cards that could work very well, I do have a couple of suggestions for you there too. Our first one out of our 2 for this week is going to be Green Sun's Zenith. So Green Sun Zenith recently reprinted in Double Masters, so it's about $11 when it was about $25 before, is X and a green for a sorcery. Search your library for a green creature card with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Shuffle Green Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So this could be a repeatable tutor, maybe we keep drawing it. But the key here is that, again, this searches out Hermit Druid, and it puts it directly into play. Yeah, it's a sorcery, but it is only going to be 3 mana to get Hermit Druid. And that is incredibly useful when you consider the fact that it's very important to our deck that we have Hermit Druid in play. And in terms of what I would replace for this, I know it sucks to take out a human, but I would recommend taking out Kitesail Freebooter, which is 1 and a black for a 1/2 human pirate. It's got flying, and when Kitesail Freebooter enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, exile that card until Kitesail Freebooter leaves the battlefield. So typically the reason you would want Kitesail is when you're about to try to cast Hermit Druid, you can check someone else's hand for counterspells, for removal, to make sure that they can't disrupt the combo. However, it's not super impactful otherwise. And yes, it's a human, and yes, it does everything that we want to do in our human deck, but people don't tend to like having their stuff stolen. Even if they could get it back by killing the freebooter, it tends to put a bit of a target on your head, which is something that we already have being a combo deck. So just for the sake of kind of limiting the targetness, I suppose, of our own deck, I would recommend replacing this with at least a tutor to make sure that when we do put that target on our back, it's at least because we have our combo pieces and we're not just kind of messing up our opponent's game plan just because we can. And our second out-of-budget upgrade for this week is going to be Concordant Crossroads. So I mentioned multiple times that haste is very hard to come by, and Concordant Crossroads is one of the only ways to do it in green. And it is 1 green for a world enchantment that says all creatures have haste. And again, a recent reprint in Double Masters brought it down to about $24, so it is cheaper than it was, but it's still a bit too expensive for our deck. However, if you can play Concordant Crossroads on turn 1 or turn 2, that means you could, in theory, cast Hermit Druid on turn 2 or turn 3 and just win right there. So it is possible to win with this deck on turn 3 if you have a Concordant Crossroads plus Hermit Druid, because of course you need the mana to activate Hermit Druid, so you got to make sure that you've at least got that as well. But it's $24, so it's very difficult to suggest putting it into the deck. However, if you happen to have one or you don't mind spending the money on it because it is very powerful, I would recommend swapping out Gather the Townsfolk, which is 1 and a white for a sorcery that says you put 2 1/1 white human creature tokens onto the battlefield, and it also has Fateful Hour. If you have 5 or less life, put 5 of those tokens onto the battlefield instead. Most of the time, this is only going to get you 2 human tokens for 2 mana at sorcery speed, which is okay, but we have other things that could be going on in this deck as well. We have a ton of humans as it is, and Gather the Townsfolk is great when we're on the aggressive beatdown plan, but honestly, that's not our main game plan. We would prefer to not have to do that if possible. So Gather the Townsfolk is good, but I don't quite think this is the deck for it, because we can't even get it back with Hermit Druid and with the Angel of Glory's Rise when we get to that point. So I don't think it does quite enough in this deck, and if you could replace it with Concordant Crossroads to just give everything haste, I think that's significantly more powerful. But that brings us to the official end of our deck tech, and we gotta see how this deck performs in a game to see how things actually work. And this week we have 2 different games. The first one is going to be against 3 different opponents. We have Sorceress playing her Omnath Locus of Mana deck. We have AngryCow playing Greven Predator Captain, and we have Bilal playing Prosper Tomebound. So Sorceress's Omnath deck we've seen before on this channel. It is, I believe, 80 or 85 forests, and the rest are non-lands. So her goal is to make her commander as big as possible, and then use the few non-lands she has to kind of pump up, power, toughness, make it unblockable, give it flying, that kind of stuff. So I am a little worried about Omnath if we're not able to put up blockers, or if she's able to get around our blockers, because we don't have a ton of removal in here. Most of our deck is focused on the combo or being aggressive, so we don't have a ton of slots for onboard removal, so hopefully Omnath isn't too much of a problem. And then next up, Cow's Greven deck is, I think out of the 3 of them, the one I am the most worried about, because Greven can be incredibly aggressive very, very quickly, and Menace means that it's very difficult to block, and I'm sure there's ways to give it trample and double strike and just pay a ton of life, and I'm a little worried that we're just going to say like, oh, I won't block, I'll take the 6 or whatever, and then he just kind of one-shots us. So I've seen Greven do some very scary things in the past, and I would expect this build to be no different from Cow. And then finally, we have Bilal's Prosper deck, which is mainly a treasure style deck. He kind of uses Prosper as just as a value engine, not really focusing on the exile so much as he is focusing on treasure makers. And I think that early game, I'm not super worried about Prosper, because I think it's going to be a lot of setup and getting ready for the later games. But I think if the game goes long, Prosper is probably the one to be concerned about, because he's just going to have so much mana that there's not going to be much any of us can do, because he's going to be drawing cards and killing things and casting spells and just generating way too much value for the rest of the table. So we'll see how this game goes. I am very much looking forward to it, but I am nervous about some of our opponents. I'm hoping we can kind of get the combo down, because nobody's playing blue, so hopefully there's at least no counter spells, but we do have to try to protect Hermit Druid and make him last a turn, so we'll see how it goes. I hope you all enjoy the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done for Game 2. At the start of the game, Sorceress goes first, followed by myself, Cow, and then Bilal. On Sorceress's first turn, she plays a forest. I play a secluded courtyard, naming Humans, and then cast a blood-soaked champion. Cow plays a bloodstained mire. Bilal plays a command tower. Sorceress plays a forest. I play a Krosan Verge and then move to combat, attacking Cow for 2 while he sacrifices his bloodstained mire to search his library for a swamp, putting it into play. Then, in my second main phase, I cast an Expedition Envoy and pass. Cow plays a Dragonskull Summit and casts a Charcoal Diamond. Bilal plays a mountain. Sorceress plays a forest and then casts her commander Omnath Locus of Mana. I play an Opal Palace and move to combat, attacking Sorceress and Bilal both for 2. Then, in my second main phase, I sacrifice Krosan Verge to search my library for a forest and a plains, but since they can be non-basics, I put Murmuring Bosk and Canopy Vista into play. Cow plays a Rogue's Passage and casts a Hedron Archive. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Professional Facebreaker, which creates him a treasure whenever one or more of his creatures do combat damage to a player, and also allows him to sacrifice a treasure to exile the top card of his library and cast it this turn. Sorceress plays a forest and then floats 4 green mana, making Omnath a 5/5, and since her commander is on board, that mana doesn't empty from her mana pool as steps and phases end. I play a Shambling Vent, cast a Selesnya Signet, and then cast my commander Anafenza the Foremost, exiling each of my opponent's creatures when they die, and letting me put a +1/+1 counter on another tapped creature whenever she attacks. I then move to combat and attack Cow for 4. Cow plays a Witch's Clinic, and then casts his commander, Greven Predator Captain, which gets +X/+0, where X is the life Cow has lost this turn, and also allows him to sacrifice a creature when he attacks, drawing cards equal to its power and losing life equal to its toughness. Bilal plays a mountain and casts Zorn, which makes an additional treasure token whenever Bilal creates any treasures. He then attacks me for 2, making 2 treasure tokens when he deals damage since his creature has Menace. Sorceress plays a forest, and then casts and equips Whisper Silk Cloak to Omnath, giving it Unblockable and Shroud. I play a Necro Blossom Snarl, and then attack Bilal with the Envoy and Anafenza, triggering my commander, putting a +1/+1 counter on the Envoy, and hitting Bilal for a total of 7 damage. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Mikaeus the Lunarch for X=5, so he comes in with 5 +1/+1 counters, and can tap to remove a counter and put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature I control, or tap to add a counter to himself. Cow plays a mountain, and then casts Pact Weapon. He immediately equips the Pact Weapon to Greven, meaning he no longer loses the game for having 0 or less life, and also draws a card when he attacks, giving Greven +X/+X, where X is the card's mana value, and also losing X life. He then attacks me with Greven, drawing a Soul Drinker, so Greven gets +4/+4, and then Cow loses 4 life, which gives Greven an additional +4/+0. Finally, Cow activates Witch's Clinic, giving Greven lifelink. This means I take a total of 14 commander damage, while Cow gains 14 life. On Bilal's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking me for 2 and creating 2 treasure tokens. In his second main phase, he casts his commander Prosper Tomebound, allowing him to create a treasure whenever he plays a card from exile, and also exiles a card at the end of his turn, allowing him to play it until the end of his next turn. After that, he plays a mountain, and then casts a Talisman of Indulgence, and in his end step, he then exiles Marionette Master with his commander, Prosper. Sorceress plays a forest, and casts Finned Horn Elves, followed by casting Lost in the Woods, allowing her to reveal the top card of her library whenever a creature attacks her, and remove it from combat if the revealed card is a forest. On my turn, I cast Sin Collector, forcing Cow to reveal his hand and allowing me to exile an instant or sorcery from it. This reveals Dockside Extortionist, Grab the Reins, Promise of Power, and Soul Drinker, so I decide to exile the Grab the Reins. Then I play a Golgari Rot Farm, returning Secluded Courtyard to my hand, and attack Cow with Anafenza and the champion, putting a counter on the champion and doing 7 total damage. On Cow's turn, he casts Dockside Extortionist, making 7 treasures when it enters, since his opponents control a total of 7 artifacts and enchantments. After that, he casts Promise of Power, losing 5 life, drawing 5 cards, and giving Greven +5/+0. Finally, he casts a Soul Drinker, which allows Cow to pay 3 life and put a +1/+1 counter on it. Once that's resolved, he moves to combat, attacking Bilal with Greven, triggering the Pact Weapon and Greven. This has him sacrifice Dockside Extortionist, drawing a card, losing 2 life, and giving Greven +2/+0. He also draws a Teamer Battle Rage with the weapon, losing 2 life and giving Greven a total of +4/+2. Before blocks, Bilal sacrifices all 3 of his treasures to exile the top 3 cards of his library, hoping to find an answer, but unfortunately he doesn't find one. This forces Bilal to block with Prosper and Zorn, but before damage, Cow casts Temur Battle Rage, giving Grevin Double Strike and Trample, trampling over Bilal's blockers to do 38 commander damage, thanks to Cow also paying 6 life to put 2 counters on Soul Drinker, knocking Bilal out of the game, and also gaining Cow 44 life since he gave Grevin lifelink with Witch's Clinic. On Sorceress's turn, she plays a Forest, and floats 8 green mana to make Omnath a 13/13, then attacks Cow for 13 unblockable damage with her commander. At the end of turn, I tap Mikaeus, removing a +1/+1 counter from him and putting a +1/+1 counter on each of my other creatures. On my turn, I play a Field of Ruin, and then attack Cow for 4 and pass. Cow plays a Mountain, and then attacks me with Grevin, triggering his commander and the Pact Weapon. This draws him Swiftfoot Boots, losing 2 life and giving Grevin +4/+2. Before blocks, I activate Shambling Vent, turning it into a 2/3 with lifelink, and then I block with the Vent and the Expedition Envoy. Before the damage, I activate Mikaeus, removing a counter from him to put +1/+1 counters on all of my creatures. However, still before damage, Cow casts Smash to destroy the Whisper Silk Cloak and draw a card. He is then able to cast Reckless Spite, destroying Omnath and the Envoy, losing 5 life and giving Grevin +5/+0. Then damage finally happens, killing my Shambling Vent but gaining me 3 life. On Sorceress's turn, she plays a Forest and then recasts her commander Omnath. She also casts Haunted Cloak, equipping it to Omnath to give him Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. Then at the end of turn, I sacrifice Field of Ruin to destroy Cow's Rogue's Passage, letting each player search their libraries for a basic land and put it into play. Then, Sorceress immediately floats the green mana that she just got to make Omnath a 2/2. On my turn, I play a Secluded Courtyard, naming Humans, and then attack Cow for 5. On Cow's turn, he casts Harness by Force, taking control of Anafenza and Mikaeus. In response, I tap Mikaeus to remove a counter from him and put a +1/+1 counter on each of my other creatures. Then, once Cow takes control of my creatures, he also taps Mikaeus to remove a counter from him and put 1 counter on each of his other creatures. After that, he attacks me with Anafenza and Grevin, triggering his commander, the Pact Weapon, and my commander. This results in him putting a +1/+1 counter on Grevin, sacrificing Anafenza, losing 8 life, drawing 8 cards, and giving Grevin +8/+0. Then, he also draws Marshland Bloodcaster for the Pact Weapon, losing 5 more life, and giving Grevin another +10/+5. However, before damage, I cast Despark to exile Grevin. But, in response, Cow pays 6 life to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Soul Drinker and give Grevin another +6/+0, making him a 26 power creature. Then, Cow casts Soul's Fire to make Grevin do damage to me equal to his power, knocking me out of the game and taking Despark off the stack. In his second main phase, Cow plays Shinka the Blood-Soaked Keep, and after that he pays 12 more life into Soul Drinker, putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it and giving Grevin +12/+0, making him a 38 power creature. This allows him to sacrifice Grevin to cast Fling, doing 38 damage to Sorceress, winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a pretty sweet game. We're going to save talking for it until we get to the wrap-up. But we're going to move on to Game 2, and in this case we're joined by several of the same opponents, but also a different one. So we still have AngryCow, in this case playing Durnan of the Yawning Portal and Haunted One, and we still have Bilal playing Miriam Sentinel Worm, but we swapped Sorceress for Shawn, who is playing his Nethroi Apex of Death deck. So, starting with Cow's Durnan and Haunted One deck, I am personally very interested in seeing how this deck runs. I've never seen a Durnan or Haunted One deck, and I think from what he said, it's kind of a human tribal deck because Durnan and Haunted One care about humans and warriors, so he wants to make sure that he's playing a ton of humans, playing a ton of warriors, and then he's going to wind up probably killing them for value, getting them back with Durnan and, well, maybe not specifically with Durnan, but with Haunted One, getting them back to the battlefield because they're all going to have Undying. So I'm super, super interested in this deck, but I really don't know what to expect, so we'll see how that one goes. Next up is Shawn's Nethroi deck, which I've played against this deck multiple times. This is a pretty brutal deck full of a bunch of reanimators and aristocrats, and he really just kind of wants to cycle his cards in and out of his graveyard and do, aristocraty and reanimation style things. And Nethroi especially is kind of like a mass reanimation, so it's super important that if he gets to the point where he could mutate Nethroi, gotta make sure his graveyard's at least pretty clear, and I think a lot of our humans are going to do a pretty good job of that, Anafenza especially. And finally, we have Bilal playing his Miriam Sentinel Worm deck, which has also shown up on this channel. And Miriam is a very powerful commander, a very scary commander. Being able to copy all of your dragons is a very powerful effect, so I am very worried about what he's doing. And one of the big issues with humans is that they don't fly, and a lot of dragons do. So I'm hoping we can kind of be super aggressive or get our combo off before the dragons get rolling, because I'm worried that if we don't, then they're going to fly over us and just kind of knock us out. So I think out of these three, I'm most concerned about Miriam, but I'm hoping we can be a little bit aggressive and kind of get Miriam down to the point where they've got to defend with the dragons rather than attack. So we'll see how it goes. Again, I'm looking forward to seeing how this deck plays and seeing how this game goes, and I hope you are as well, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of Game 2, AngryCow goes first, followed by Shawn, myself, and then Bilal. On Cow's first turn, he plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1. Shawn plays a Scattered Groves. I play an Uncharted Haven, naming green. Bilal plays a Misty Rainforest, sacrificing it to search his library for a Ketria Triome. Cow plays a Forest, and then casts Channeler Initiate, which enters with 3 -1/-1 counters, and can be tapped to remove a -1/-1 counter and make a mana of any color. Shawn plays a Temple Garden tapped. I play a Shambling Vent, and then cast Experiment 1, which has Evolve and can be regenerated by removing 2 counters from it. Bilal plays a Flooded Grove. Cow plays a Swamp, and casts his commander Durnan of the Yawning Portal, which allows him to look at the top 4 cards of his library when Durnan attacks, exiling a creature from among them, giving it Undaunted, and being able to cast it for as long as it remains in exile. Shawn plays an Isolated Chapel, and then casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. I play a Temple of Malady, scrying 1, and then cast Selesnya Signet. Bilal plays a Hinterland Harbor. Cow moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 3 with Durnan, triggering his commander, exiling Disciple of Griselbrand. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Disciple of Griselbrand, being able to activate it to sacrifice a creature and gain life equal to its toughness. He then plays a Swamp and casts Shadowheart Dark Justicar, which can sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to its power. Shawn plays a Swamp and then casts Deathrite Shaman. On my turn, I play a Thriving Grove, naming white, and cast Benevolent Bodyguard, which can be sacrificed to give another creature protection from any color until the end of turn. Bilal plays an Unclaimed Territory, naming Dragons. Cow plays a Survivor's Encampment and casts his other commander, Haunted One, which gives all his humans or warriors Undying and +2/+0 whenever Durnan becomes tapped. He then attacks Bilal for 1 and me for 3 with Durnan, exiling Canopy Tactician and giving all his creatures +2/+0 and Undying, so I take 5 and Bilal takes 3. Then in his second main phase, he activates Shadowheart, sacrificing the Channeler Initiate to draw 5 cards, and then the Channeler returns to play thanks to Undying. However, since it returns with a +1/+1 counter and 3 -1/-1 counters, it only winds up with 2 -1/-1 counters. After that, he casts a Retribution of the Ancients, allowing him to remove X +1/+1 counters from among creatures he controls to give target creature -X/-X until end of turn. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Forest and activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Path of Ancestry from Cow's graveyard to make a green mana. He uses that mana to cast Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite, giving all his creatures +2/+2, and all his opponent's creatures -2/2, killing Cow's Channeler Initiate, Disciple of Grizzlebrand, My Benevolent Bodyguard, and Experiment 1. Then at the end of turn, I cast Eladamri's Call, searching my library for a creature, in this case Hermit Druid, putting it into my hand. On my turn, I play a Hissing Quagmire, and then cast my commander Anafenza the Foremost, exiling any of my opponent's creatures that would be put into the graveyard, and also putting a +1/+1 counter on another tapped creature whenever she attacks. Bilal plays an island, and casts Furkrag Cunning Instigator, which goads another creature whenever one or more dragons that Bilal controls attacks, and also allows him to put a +1/+1 counter on Furkrag and draw a card when a goaded creature deals damage to one of his opponents. He immediately attacks Shawn for 1, goading Elesh Norn. Cow plays a Grasping Dunes, and then attacks Bilal with Durnan, triggering both of his commanders, giving his team +2/+0, undying and exiling Necrotal. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Necrotal, destroying Elesh Norn when it enters, but also dying thanks to Elesh Norn's ability, exiling both creatures due to Anafenza's ability. Once that's resolved, he casts a Canopy Tactician, giving his other elves +1/+1, and also being able to tap for 3 green mana. On Shawn's turn, he casts Teysa Karlov, doubling up on his death triggers, and then plays a Golgari Rot Farm, returning a swamp to hand. On my turn, I cast Adaptive Automaton, naming Human, so all other humans I control get +1/+1. I also cast General Kudro, giving all my other humans +1/+1, and also exiling a card from a graveyard whenever I play a human, exiling Bilal's Misty Rainforest this time. Moving to combat, I attack Shawn for 6 with Anafenza, and then pass. Bilal plays a Rockfall Veil and casts Immrith Desert Doom. He then attacks me for 3, goading Anafenza. Cow plays a Forest, and then attacks Shawn with Durnan, triggering both of his commanders, giving his team +2/+0, undying, and exiling Gilt Leaf Winnower. Then Shawn takes 5 commander damage. In his second main phase, he casts Sir Conrad the Grim, making each opponent take a damage whenever any creature goes to the graveyard from anywhere, or a creature leaves Cow's graveyard. He also casts a Zathrid Necromancer, which creates a 2/2 zombie token whenever one of his humans dies. Then at the end of turn, Shawn activates Deathrite Shaman to exile Disciple of Grizzlebrand from Cow's graveyard, doing 1 damage to each of Cow's opponents and gaining Shawn 2 life. Shawn plays a Golgari Guildgate, and then casts Izoni Thousand-Eyed, not making any insect tokens when she enters since there are no creatures in Shawn's graveyard. On my turn, I cast an Orzhov Signet, and also cast Lenore Autumn Sovereign, which allows me to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature I control when I go to combat, and then drawing me a card if I control 3 creatures with different powers. I immediately do so, putting the counter on Lenore and drawing a card. I then attack Shawn with Anafenza, and Cow with General Kudro. On attacks, Anafenza puts a +1/+1 counter on the General, and then Shawn takes 6 commander damage, drawing Bilal a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on Furkrag since Anafenza was goaded, while Cow takes 5 damage. In my second main phase, I play a Golgari Rot Farm, returning the Temple of Malady to my hand. Bilal casts Garruk's Uprising, drawing a card when it enters since he has a creature with power 4 or greater, drawing him a card whenever he plays a creature with power 4 or greater, and also giving all his creatures trample. He then plays Castle Garenbrig and casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. He moves to combat, attacking me for 4, goading Anafenza again. Cow plays a Swamp, and casts Hex Parasite, which can be activated to remove a number of counters from any permanent equal to the amount of mana paid into it. He also casts a Gilt Leaf Winnower, destroying target creature whose power and toughness aren't equal, destroying Lenore, and doing 1 damage to each of Cow's opponents thanks to Sir Conrad. He moves to combat, attacking Bilal with Durnan, and me with the Zathrid Necromancer and Sir Conrad. This triggers both of his commanders, giving his team +2/+0, undying, and exiling Slippery Bogbonder. Then I take 10, and Bilal takes 5 commander damage. In his second main phase, Cow casts Obelisk Spider, which puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature when it deals damage and also makes each opponent lose a life, while Cow gains a life whenever he puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature. He also casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. Shawn plays a Forest and activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Lenore from my graveyard, gaining 2 life. He then casts a Path to Exile, exiling Anafenza and letting me search my library for a basic land, but unfortunately I don't have any, so I fail to find. He then activates Izoni, sacrificing Teysa to draw a card and gain a life, and this also triggers Sir Conrad, making each of Cow's opponents lose a life. Shawn then casts Living Death, and in response, Cow activates Shadowheart to sacrifice Gilt-Leaf Winnower, drawing 4 cards and doing 1 damage to each of his opponents. Then, Living Death resolves and exiles all creatures from all graveyards, doing 3 damage to all of Cow's opponents with Sir Conrad. Then, it forces each player to sacrifice all creatures they control, killing a total of 14 creatures, triggering Sir Conrad and doing 14 damage to each of Cow's opponents, knocking me out of the game. This also makes Cow 4 zombie tokens since he has 4 humans die, and then all exiled creatures return to play under their owner's control. This ends up with Cow getting back Gilt-Leaf Winnower, which has no targets to destroy, Plaguecrafter, which makes each player sacrifice a creature or discard a card if they have no creatures, and Channeler Initiate, which puts 3 -1/-1 counters on itself, while Shawn gets back Teysa, which immediately dies to Plaguecrafter, and Bilal had no creatures in his graveyard to get back. Bilal then plays a Forest and casts Dragon Tempest, giving all his flying creatures haste and also doing X damage to any target when a dragon enters under his control, where X is the number of dragons he controls. He also casts his commander Miriam Sentinel Worm, drawing a card, doing 1 damage to Cow, and allowing him to make a token copy of any non-token dragon that enters under his control. Cow recasts his commander Durnan, and then attacks Shawn with Plaguecrafter and a zombie, and also attacks Bilal with Gilt-Leaf Winnower and 2 zombies. Before the blocks, he also activates Survivor's Encampment to tap Durnan, giving his team +2/+0 and Undying. Bilal blocks and kills a zombie token with his commander, taking 8 total damage, while Shawn takes 7 damage, knocking him out of the game. In Cow's second main phase, he casts a Ruthless Technomancer, sacrificing Gilt-Leaf Winnower when it enters to make 6 treasure tokens. Then, the Winnower returns to play with a +1/+1 counter thanks to Undying. When it returns to play, it destroys Channeler Initiate, which also comes back thanks to Undying, except with 2 -1/-1 counters due to its own ability. He also casts an Outland Liberator, immediately sacrificing it to its own ability to destroy Bilal's Dragon Tempest. Bilal casts Inferno of the Starmount, making a copy of it with Miriam, but before the dragons resolve, Cow casts Nature's Claim to destroy Garruk's Uprising, gaining Bilal 4 life, but preventing him from drawing any cards. Bilal then casts Earthquake Dragon, making a copy of it with Miriam, and also plays a Vine Glimmer Snarl, and at the end of turn, Cow flashes in a Slippery Bogbonder, putting a hexproof counter on Durnan. On Cow's turn, he plays a Swamp, and attacks Bilal with his entire board, triggering both of his commanders, giving his creatures +2/+0, Undying, and exiling Somberwald Beastmaster. Bilal blocks as much as he can with his dragons, leaving the zombies and Channeler unblocked. Before damage, Cow activates Retribution of the Ancients, removing a +1/+1 counter from Gilt-Leaf Winnower to give Miriam -1/-1 until end of turn, paying 2 extra because of Ward. Then, damage happens, doing 6 damage to Bilal, killing Miriam and most of Cow's board, but thanks to Undying, they all come right back into play with +1/+1 counters. When everything returns, the Plaguecrafter forces each player to sacrifice a creature, killing the copy of Inferno and Channeler Initiate. Then the Initiate returns with a trigger to put 3 -1/-1 counters on it. Responding to that trigger, Cow resolves the Technomancer's ability, sacrificing Gilt-Leaf Winnower to make 5 treasure tokens. Then he activates Technomancer's other ability, sacrificing 3 artifacts, in this case treasure tokens, to return Obelisk Spider to play. Then the Channeler's ability resolves, putting 3 -1/-1 counters on itself, triggering Obelisk Spider to make Bilal lose a life while Cow gains a life, and finally, the Slippery Bogbonder resolves, putting a hexproof counter on Durnan and moving all other counters to him as well, which includes the -1/-1 counters, triggering the obelisk spider again, making Bilal lose another life, and winning Cow the game. Alright, so those were some super sweet games. Now, unfortunately, we never quite got our combo to go off. We did have Hermit Druid in the second game, and honestly, maybe I should have just played it earlier. I was worried about it getting destroyed or someone removing it, but you never know. Maybe there was a chance we could have gotten away with it, so I probably should have just gone for it. And I do also have to say a quick congrats to AngryCow for his back-to-back victories in this video. Being able to knock people out with Greven was super impressive, especially because he killed one player with commander damage and then killed another right away with Soul's Fire and then killed another one with a fling. It was very, very impressive. I was super impressed by Greven, and it was a super sweet deck to see go off. I think that in the first game, the Omnath deck also kind of just did what it wanted to do, made a ton of mana, also got within threatening range with Omnath, made it a 13/13, and then the Lost in the Woods was kind of the MVP, because at one point, Cow could have swung at Sorceress and knocked her out of the game, but he was worried that Lost in the Woods would turn up a forest, and so he wouldn't have been able to get through damage. But she actually revealed that the card she drew that turn was a non-land, so if he had attacked her, she would have died. So definitely a very sweet play with Lost in the Woods, and definitely some spicy tech, because that's not something you would expect, but if you've got 80 plus lands in your deck, that seems really good, especially if you're trying to stop combat. And then the Prosper deck didn't do too much, but it did get quite the engine rolling, and I think that if Bilal had had one or two more turns, he really could have started to pop off. So I think that killing him at that point was the right idea, but I don't necessarily know if he would have had the cards he needed to win the game, although that Marionette Master being exiled under Prosper was definitely pretty terrifying. So the first game, super sweet, and a big shout out to Cow for winning that one. And then in our second game, we again didn't quite get to do what we wanted to do. We were pretty aggressive in the second game, but I think that overall the Durnan deck that Cow put together, also very impressive. I know I keep saying that about some of Cow's decks, but really sweet. Seeing all the -1/-1 synergies with Undying was super cool, and I probably wouldn't have thought of that myself. And it really was just a ton of value, and seeing the line at the end with the obelisk spider was super sweet, very cool. Definitely looking forward to playing against that deck again in the future. I was also, though, right in my prediction about Miriam being very scary, because the turn that the dragons all came out, so the Earthquake Dragon and the Inferno, if Bilal's enchantment hadn't been destroyed and they had had haste, he would have just been able to straight up kill Cow and kind of steal the game at the end there. So I think that just goes to show the power of Miriam, that he had a 6/6 on board, and then the next turn he could have swung for almost 40 damage, so very, very scary. And finally, of course, Shawn's Nethroi deck really got shut down by my Anafenza. He couldn't do too much because of it. He was afraid to cast his creatures and kill them because he didn't want them to get exiled. I do think, though, that the Living Death was a bit of a mistake, and I think Shawn mentioned that as well, that he made a mistake in casting it, because he had intended to use it a bit like a board wipe to get rid of all of Cow's creatures, but he didn't consider that Sir Conrad was going to do so much damage, and that it was still going to leave Cow with a smaller board, while everyone else didn't really have anything. So very interesting. I don't know what would have happened if that hadn't occurred, but let me know what you all think, if the Living Death was the right call using it as a board wipe just because Sir Conrad was going to win the game, or if you think maybe there was something else that could have been done. I'm very interested to hear it, because I know in my situation I probably would have just died anyway. I didn't have any way to answer it, so I just wish I could have survived through the Living Death to play the Hermit Druid. Maybe next time. But with all of that being said, I suppose that brings us to the end of our deck tech for the week and the end of our gameplay video. So I hope you all enjoyed it. Please, as always, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you did. If you have any suggestions for future cards that you would like to see turned into decks, please do let me know in the comments below. And as always, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.